questions in the chat box. Yeah. Sanjay sir, good to go.
Yeah.
So, good evening to one and all. And this gives me immense pleasure as being the conference convener today to invite you yet again to the day 3 of the International Conference on Governance and Policy Reforms and Indo Pacific Perspective, organized by the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Humanities at Jagran Lakecity University in collaboration with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. So the past 3 days have been something very, very, very productive. And adding to the flavor to what we have been there across, I welcome the guests for today. And it has been a super pleasure for me that each of the day that we have been seeing across, right from the day 1, which was on 12th, followed by the second day yesterday, and today the third day. We have been joined by some luminaries who have not only expanded the concept, but also have given some various ideas on how the governance and the policy reform should be an ignited step towards those things. So not taking much of the time, it's my intense pleasure today to introduce the keynote speaker and the chairperson for today's session. As the keynote speaker, we have Dr. Frank Umbach, who is the research director of the European Cluster of Climate, Energy and Resource Security, EU-CERS, Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies, CASSIS, University of Bonn, Germany. Executive advisor at the Proventus Partners, an M&A company, Munich. Adjunct senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, at the Nanyang Technology Institute, NTU in Singapore. Visiting professor on EU energy external policies and governance at the College of Europe in Natal in Warsaw, Poland. Senior lecturer at the University of Bonn and international consultant at NATO. The Gresson Lerman Group and the Wikistart.com on international energy and climate security, geopolitical risk, supply security of critical raw materials, cybersecurity and critical energy infrastructure protections, and maritime security policies in Asia Pacific. I'd also take this responsibility to introduce today's chairperson. Dr. Vijay Kumar is the Vice Chancellor at the National Law Institute, University, Bhopal. A graduate of Madras University, Dr. Vijay Kumar was the VC at the Ambedkar Law University, Chennai from 2010 to 2013. He has also served as registrar at NLSIU from 2005 to 2008. He has been a professor of law since 1997 and has taught at Presidency College, Madras, before he joined the NLSIU. He specializes in constitutional law, administrative law, human rights law, law of elections, refugee and humanitarian law. And one line which is not mentioned earlier, he is my teacher also. So it gives me an immense pleasure to welcome both today. And without taking much of this time, I would request Dr. Frank Umbach for his keynote address. Over to you, Frank.
Divanshu, could you unmute Dr. Rimele also?
I'll do that.
Yes, thank you very, very much. I would firstly, of course, thank you, the Jagran Lakecity University and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and Mr. Rimele personally for having me invited to this very prestigious conference. Of course, it would be even a bigger pleasure if I would have an opportunity to come to India, but under the circumstances we have in India as well as here still in Germany, traveling has not been possible for me for more than 1.5 years, something which I have never experienced in over 20 years. So even I couldn't go to Singapore, where I'm normally also working for the RSIS Institute. But nonetheless, it's a pleasure for joining you for today and giving you a larger overview of the governmental, global governmental and policy reforms in the climate and the energy field. May I ask you, the organizers, because I can't see my presentation now, do I have to load it again, or?
Professor Umbach, you may have to load it once. You may have to upload. Yeah, here it is.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. What I will do is we will have at the end of the year the COP26 Global Climate Summit in Glasgow. Also in the light of the recent global energy megatrends and the global climate discussion, also by taking into account the global COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts on the global energy megatrends, I will try to give an overview of the global climate policies as well as on the energy megatrends, and asking the question where we are standing and where we are heading. And of course, we have the climate and decarbonization targets and reducing the global warming down to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius. When we take the global energy megatrends into account prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the overall direction as analyzed by various institutions and experts concluded in 2019 that we are still on the process of a global warming up to 3 degrees Celsius or 3.5 degrees of Celsius. That means we are far behind actually in achieving the Paris Agreement targets as well as the global climate targets of 2 degrees Celsius or even 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, there are some, of course, positive developments, but I will also address those trends which doesn't favor these climate targets. A positive trend can be seen also on the EU side, which has, together with the so-called European Green Deal, adopted or announced in December 2019 and then approved and confirmed throughout the year 2020, in adopting a more ambitious goal in reducing the European greenhouse gas emissions. The previous goal in the midterm perspective by 2030 was approximately 40% towards the level of 1990, and that has been improved and enhanced up to 55%. And we are still struggling in developing actually the right instruments and strategies, and there will be major announcement in the forthcoming days about a whole package in achieving these kind of targets. And of course, that will continue over the next months and certainly years, when we have also to review whether those new instruments and strategies will be sufficient or not. The global COVID-19 pandemic had, of course, huge implications, both on the climate developments as well as the energy developments. Positively, of course, the situation has led to a reduction or a stagnation of CO2 emissions. But the basic question is, with a potential global or a worldwide economic recovery, whether we will see that the CO2 emissions will go up or rather stagnate in the years to come. But even if they stagnate, it will be completely insufficient in addressing the 2 degrees Celsius target. There are several analyses which have concluded during the last years that from today, from the year 2021, we would need an annual decrease of more than 7% of global CO2 emission in achieving the 2 degrees Celsius target. And we are still far behind in that we can see such a substantial annual decrease by emissions up to the year 2030 already. On the global energy trends, I think we see also contradicting developments. On one hand, we see renewables, and I will see it with some other slides in a minute, how renewables have expanded, have become more cheaper, and that has certainly helped, particularly in Europe, and I think even we see that in the US market too, as the fossil fuels are replaced by renewables, but not to the speed necessary as it would be, as we will also see with the recent publication of the International Energy Agency, which a few weeks ago published a net zero carbon emission reduction pathway. And we will see also in a slide in a minute how far we are running behind that. Of course, there are positive developments in the foreign policy field as well as in the climate and energy policies with the new US Biden administration, which has immediately decided to return to the Paris Agreement and started various initiatives, as we have just seen that in the G20 summit in addressing climate policies, even with Russia and with China, beyond other controversial issues, which will certainly be maintained in the bilateral relationship of the US with Russia as well as with China. So there, in this respect, as the recent G7 and G20 climate cooperation, I think there's much more hope in the years to come. If we take the global vaccination campaign and developments into account, then of course I think there's huge concern if we take a global view into account and not just looking to our own countries, particularly here in Europe and the US. But you see on the left side that some countries have gone ahead with the vaccine rollouts much faster than others. And what really concerns, and you may read a comment by Martin Wolf today in the Financial Times, where he also addressed that also the recent decisions within the framework of the G20 to support a global vaccination campaign is completely insufficient. And that relates, of course, then also to the sustainability goals we have agreed within the United Nations as well as within the G20 frameworks. So I don't want to read everything I put here in my presentation. I will make the presentation available so that you can read also the more the details. But of course, you can conclude from the developments during the last years that the world has indeed made progress in addressing clean cooking, getting access to electricity, etc. But it's also clear that there's a huge task ahead, alongside also of the worldwide population increase in the forthcoming years and decades in addressing major sustainability goals, which had been, as I said, basically agreed. And I will come back to those issues also in some minutes. Just an overview, what we see on the global energy megatrends is a tremendous change already since 2010. And if you work for a longer time like me on global energy development, I need to remind myself that until 2010, it doesn't seem to have a faster development with new technologies coming forward. So this started only in 2010 approximately, before we had a rather slowing evolutionary development also on the technology side. And then we had this major development in the US with the oil and gas, shale oil and gas revolution, which had tremendous implications not just on the US oil and gas market, but also on the worldwide oil and gas market. Until 2010, we had often discussed at various conferences the so-called peak oil challenges. Yeah? The belief that we're running out of oil worldwide, and with the peak oil forecasted by around 2020, the overall assumption until 2010 was that then the competition for the remaining oil reserves would intensify worldwide, would lead to much intensified competition and maybe even to military conflicts. So that has not happened. Yeah, what we're having today is rather the opposite. We have an abundance of fossil fuels available. We do not have to talk any longer about the scarcity of reserves and resources which we can use. The problem is rather that we cannot use all these fossil fuels because that would even lead to a higher global warming. And so the question is how fast we can enhance the global energy transition, the decarbonization going away from the fossil fuel age. And here we see a tremendous fastening of various technologies coming forward, which are changing the markets. For the older managers of the industry, they are often telling me they've never seen this kind of speed of changing markets and technologies being introduced worldwide. And that provides, of course, new opportunities, but it also creates a lot of challenges and problems. What I will do is, in the following minutes, giving at first an overview, as I said, on the global warming mitigation developments and challenges, then on the energy megatrends, and then screening a little bit some of the major global emitters and energy producers and reviewing their policies, and then asking the questions where we are heading. You see on the left side, the global CO2 emission development from the 1960s here to the year 2020. You see that CO2 emissions, of course, as a result of the pandemic, had been reduced in the year 2020. But you see on the right side, three different scenarios which are being used by the International Energy Agency. And the SDS development scenario is the sustainable development scenario. This scenario is being developed alongside for achieving the 2 degrees Celsius or a 1.5 Celsius target. Yeah, and the red one, the STEP scenario, is actually the scenario which is being reflected by the current energy megatrends. And you see the huge difference in existing where we are heading with the announced and planned energy reforms, by taking into account in the STEP scenario and the sustainable scenario where we have to go. See on the following slide that the energy sector is a major contributor of the global CO2 emissions and the greenhouse emissions by more than 70%. And so the energy sector had been and will be very much in the center in addressing the decarbonization goals. However, that's something which is changing now in Europe with a more ambitious CO2 policy by reducing emissions by 55% by the year 2030, as I already said. We have recognized that the energy sector alone will not be able to bring that kind of result. That means we have more and more to go, like to the transport sector with electric mobility now, but also to sectors which have not been addressed so far, like in the industry, let's say the energy intensive industry, like the chemical industry, for example, in Europe, or the agriculture sector, which have hardly been addressed in bringing their contributions to achieving the decarbonization goals. And of course, on a global scale, there's a tremendous change which we now need to reflect and which has often been overlooked, I think, in Europe. You see here that the EU had in the year 2000 and in 1990 still a 20% share. That has gone down to just 10%, and at the moment we are covering or responsible for approximately still 9 to 10% of the global emissions, and that share on the European side for the global emissions will go down even to approximately 5–6% by the year 2030. At the same time, Chinese emissions have increased from 11 to 27%. India's have also been more than doubled. Of course, not in comparison with Europe's or the United States or China, it's still much lower. But of course, they are also significantly increasing. On the right side, you see pretty new estimate, which is based on the energy developments and CO2 emission developments in the year 2020 during the pandemic, where from the autumn of last year, in contrast to Europe and the United States, the economic recovery in China has already started and has been very much impressive. But it has also led to much higher emissions, to a return of emissions like last December, which has achieved a similar level as we have seen it on the Chinese side before the outbreak of COVID-19. So the Chinese share is approximately, meanwhile, a little bit more than 30%. Yeah, so that means whatever we do here in Europe or even in the United States or even in combination, as you see on the right side, if you combine the shares of EU, the United States and Japan and some others, is still together combined still meanwhile lower than the Chinese share solely. So the world will not achieve anything without China and bringing China on board. And that's the huge challenge we face. And we will later see there are still disturbing trends on the Chinese energy policy, which goes certainly not in the right directions by taking the global decarbonization goals and targets into account. What is also important, there is a positive development since last year that more and more countries have committed to a global zero carbon goal either by the year 2050 or 2060, as in the case of China. Yeah? However, what we need to do globally is to address even the midterm perspective and adapting a more ambitious decarbonization goals already by the year 2030, alongside what the Europeans and the EU did, if we want to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius targets. And that's something which is still lacking. We have the long-term goals, but we do not have, in most of the other countries of the world, any kind of midterm perspective goals by the year 2030, and certainly not in regard to the impacts of the pandemic. You see on the left side emissions per capita, which of course are in the United States as well as in a number of other countries still much higher than in most of the developing countries and even in China. But it's also clear, as you see on the right side, that the share of emerging and developing countries generating CO2 emissions has, of course, increased over the years and time. So the argument is fully understandable on my side, on the European side, that richer countries and the OECD countries need to go ahead. Particularly in the light of the per capita emissions, which are still higher, let's say in India or in most of other developing countries. Yeah? However, it's also clear if only the OECD countries are adopting ambitious CO2 targets, we won't be able to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius. So this is the center of the debate, which we will enter over the forthcoming months, particularly with the perspective of the Glasgow summit. I think the Europeans went ahead. The United States followed, despite a number of uncertainties, which I will also address in a minute. However, if China, India, Brazil, and many other major emitters will also not adopt more ambitious goals, we will definitely not achieve the 2 degrees Celsius target. There are also new issues which you need also to take into account. There are issues which haven't been addressed very much up to now. One of those issues is, of course, the natural gas flaring, which is developed or which is being produced alongside of the oil production, which means that gas is developing, which is just burned into the air rather than being used or contaminated, because that produces huge amounts of CO2, which you can prevent. At the same time, when I was speaking about the decline or stagnation of CO2 during the last years, what we see now is rather increase of methane emissions, which are up to 80 times more dangerous than CO2 emission. And methane emissions, even in the year 2020, during the time of the pandemic, have significantly been increased. And you see here also those countries which need to address these gas flaring as well as the methane emission as soon as possible. It's no longer CO2 which we have to focus on. Climate warming is particularly challenging for the Asia-Pacific region. That's the basic conclusion many studies during the last years have made. As the sea levels rising and global warming, particularly hitting those countries, particularly also emerging and developing countries in Asia, which may create tremendous challenges in the years ahead. That's something which still needs to become more common sense in Asia itself. It seems to me, because fully understandable is the concern of the further economic development. And particularly when you take the COVID-19 pandemic into account. But on the other hand, the climate warming is not waiting. So it needs to be addressed somehow, at least in trying to slow down that global warming. And this is a slide which I found in a larger study by McKinsey, which was focusing on climate warming and its impacts on Asia. Again, I don't want to read all the details, but you may take a look in this and other studies why Asia and India should be so much concerned about the impacts of global warming hitting Asia much more than other parts of the world. When you're looking to the baseline scenarios and targets, you see the proposed emission cuts by the various countries, but also using different kind of baselines. It's either the year 1990 as in the European case, but very often it's also the year 2005, which of course makes also a difference if you use the baseline 1990 or 2005. And so these are the announced targets, which can be seen certainly positively, but it's also clear it's completely insufficient what has been decreed up to now. When we're looking to India's greenhouse gas emissions, and I already argued that India's energy and climate policies become ever more important for the global developments, we should also make a fair assessment in terms when you take the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions into account. And when you take and compare India's climate and energy policies and targets and what has been agreed and what has not been agreed in terms of the net zero carbon emission target, for example, then it becomes clear that still India needs to make, from my point of view, a more ambitious or undertake a more ambitious policies. But it's also fair to argue, even when it would only agree to a net zero carbon emission target by the year 2090, it will be still lower than the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions of the EU, the US, or China. Yeah. I think this is also something we have on our side here on the European side when we focus on global emission reductions. And a fair contribution by Asian countries, including India, which we also need to take into account. As I said, the net emissions or net zero carbon emissions targets have also been analyzed in regard to which extent policies are already in place in the various power sectors in the various countries, such as power sectors, a few decarbonization, transport, buildings, and other sectors. And you see here a scoreboard which has been produced by Bloomberg, which gives a pretty good overview of the various countries, what kind of efforts have been undertaken up to now. When we take the longer term decarbonization into account, of course, a major question is, particularly for oil and gas producers such as Russia, of course, the United States too, but it has a much more diversified economy. But when you take the OPEC countries into account, to which extent these countries which generate 60, 70, 80% and more of their state budgets coming from oil and gas exports. And the question is how they will have survive economically, how they can diversify their economy. And in many regards, all these oil and gas producing countries, with few exceptions, are hardly being prepared for this long-term decarbonization efforts. Saudi Arabia has initiated a 2030 vision for its country in diversifying its economy, not relying on oil and gas exports as of today. But most of the other countries, including Russia, have no plan whatsoever, even not for the longer term 2050, in developing diversified economy, which should be a major concern for the rest of the world, because if they're not prepared, then either the 2 degrees Celsius target is becoming ever more unrealistic, and on the same time, with the decarbonization underway, even as low as scenarios, these countries won't have any kind of hard income for their state budget any longer as before. So here again, major questions need to be addressed. And of course, for all countries, that means they have to deal also with balancing, creating new jobs with the losses of the jobs and the fossil fuel industry, particularly oil and gas, but as well as of coal. And that is a major task already by the year 2030, where more and more jobs in the fossil fuel industry will be lost. And that's something which governments, including for social policies, need to take into account. Let me just give some of the overview of the energy megatrends. As an analyst, we always focusing on the so-called energy triangle, energy dilemma, where energy security is determined by three major factors: security of supply, environmental climate policies, and economic competitiveness. In this light, it's of most importance that we balancing the three objectives. Something which I see critically as not doing enough in the, let's say, in the European and the German case, where we often take the climate policies, determining the rest of the other policies, and then leading to imbalances and also to the problems we are facing today. An additional major factor, not just in Europe, I have seen that also in Asia, I have seen that in Latin America, is the factor of public acceptance. And public acceptance of new energy policies is a major issue which needs to be addressed more forcefully and more adequately with local people within societies. Otherwise, without the support of local people, you can't implement very often energy projects, and you can't get the political support for consuming behavior, for example, some factor which will become an ever more important factor in the years and decades ahead. As you can see here, that was a slide I prepared already 2 years ago for a study I made for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in the Hong Kong office on energy security and digitalization, where I included a number of new technology trends which have a number of positive benefits, no doubt, but also creates new energy security risks, such as rising cyber risk and vulnerabilities, the socio-economic political stability of oil and gas producing countries, and also addressing new issues such as increasing supply of security risk of critical raw materials, which are being used for electric mobility, for batteries, as well as for magnets, which you use in wind power, solar panels, and others. Again, just a look to the energy impacts of the global pandemic. As you can see here, projected from the last autumn, it was more or less confirmed actually by the latest data which we received. And you see something which is most concerning. Of course, you can hint that coal consumption has gone down, oil consumption has gone down, can be seen positively in the decarbonization as part of a decarbonization art. But you also see, and that's most worrying, is that the energy investment has tremendously gone down. Yeah, and that's of course not helping the energy transition and moving away from the energy field. You see on the right side, also sustainability efforts have been stalled by the COVID-19 impact. Yeah, and when you see here, on one hand, the STEP scenario being developed before as COVID-19, and the IEA has then developed DHS scenario, is a delayed COVID-19 scenario, delayed economic recovery scenario, then of course also sustainability goals will become even more difficult to achieve in the years ahead as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the insufficient energy investments, particularly in renewables and electricity grids. You see here on the left side the three major scenarios, again, in which the IEA has worked for years. And as said, the STEP scenario is something which you find here as a stated policy scenario. And then you have the sustainable development scenario in the center, in the mid, which highlights the 2 degrees Celsius target. And this is the scenario where we have to go. And we are very far from that scenario still. You see on the right side some of the more positive factor, and that is a tremendous decline of renewables, which has led to a situation where renewables in Europe and now even in the United States have become competitive with fossil fuels. Yeah, in the United States, even in the US market, we will see that renewables become more competitive even than natural gas, which has greatly benefited during the last years from the coal to gas change as a result of the shale gas revolution. But then we can expect that renewables will expand even more faster what we have seen during the last years. However, I should also add and put some water into the wine, which is often being overlooked by many experts, because if you expand renewables, you need also, by taking into account not just the costs which are decreasing by renewables, but also the increasing costs you have by modernizing the electricity grids. You have also to pay huge of subsidies for coal and natural gas power stations, which you still need in the time when no sun and no wind is available. But that means coal and natural gas power plants or nuclear power plants then only being operated as a kind of backup for renewables. Yeah. And that means they are operated only a few hours a day and not 24 hours as it was in the past. And that's no longer profitable. That means you have to subsidize those power plants. Otherwise, you would have no stability in the electricity grid. And these kind of costs, as a result of the expansion of renewables, are called sometimes hidden costs. I call it more systemic costs, but this needs to be taken into account and not overlooked. Otherwise, you're running also in huge difficulties in maintaining the electricity stability. I already mentioned that the International Energy Agency has introduced some weeks ago a scenario, net zero carbon emission scenario, which concluded that from this year, beginning, the world do not have to invest any longer in fossil fuel projects at all. Yeah, and as expected, on my side and others, that was something being called around the world, including by member countries of the IEA, such as Japan, as completely unrealistic. Yeah. This is a scenario which would lead realistically to a 2 degrees Celsius scenario. But it suggests that you would have to stop all worldwide investments in fossil fuel projects beginning with this year. And that's something which I also think, again, it's completely unrealistic, but just highlighting the contradictions you have, where we have to go and where we stand. These are 2 additional slides. On the right side, you see a number of measures and strategies being suggested by the IEA in achieving the 2 degrees Celsius by the year 2050. The following slide I will address again, as I argued before, that of course the OECD countries need to go ahead with more ambitious climate mitigation efforts and decarbonization efforts, but it's also clear that emerging and developing countries have become ever more important in achieving the 2 degrees Celsius. And that is something, as you can see here, particularly also on the right side, when you see the total energy supply in emerging and developing countries in the year 2020, last year, and how they need to change the energy mixes in achieving a net zero carbon goal by the year 2050. Going a little bit further, otherwise I'm already a little bit running out of time. Just few slides why, of course, the coal consumption is so much, very much in the international headlines. The coal phase out in Europe has already started, but even in the German case, after the nuclear phase out, the present coal out target has been just agreed for the year 2038. My guess is that after the next national elections, which will probably involve the Green Party, we will see that this kind of target will be changed to the year 2035 or even to the year 2030. But it's also clear if only Europe is phasing out coal, and maybe the United States too, where we have seen a longer time phase out already taking place, even under Trump, then it becomes clear if the rest of the world, like China, India, and others, are not adopting policies and strategies for a long-term phase out of coal, we will not achieve anything with the phase out in Europe. So that is something which needs to be also to be addressed globally. And this is, of course, on India's side, you have seen that over the last months that the pressure has increased on the Indian government to change the course, which is still relying very much on coal in contrast to other parts of the world. Of course, even more important is China, no doubt about it. But also ASEAN, which is very often overlooked in these global debates, has huge plans still to build and introduce hundreds of new coal power plants around the world. And you see on the right side that China is still very much heading of others. China has introduced a high number of coal power plants in 2020 in the amount what Germany is phasing out completely by the year 2035. So it has built and begun to operate in 2020 more power plants than Germany is phasing out by the year 2038. A big problem is in this respect, even Africa, where China is financing and building coal power plants, even in countries which have never coal power plants in the past. So not all, of course, these 2,500 coal power plants will be built, I'm pretty sure. But of course, the entire direction of these developments is running completely contrary to the 2 degrees Celsius target. Very shortly, few slides more on China. China has, on one hand, tremendously decreased coal consumption, which should be also being acknowledged. But on the other hand, the share is still by 58%, and China is still building, as I said, pretty high number of new coal power plants, despite the global climate policies and its own obligations. It also, China is not only the largest financing source for renewables worldwide, not just in its own country, but also worldwide, but it's also the largest financer and builder of coal power plants abroad in the world. Even in Europe, it's even finding. On the other hand, China is also moving very much ahead of nuclear power becomes the largest source of using nuclear power, replacing even the United States. And it wants to become the leading country also of exporting nuclear power plants. And therefore, for example, the pilot project in UK has been of tremendous importance of China in terms of its security reputation. But it also highlights that nuclear power is an important source of investment in regard or in Asia. So Asia has become the largest source also for nuclear power investment. I'm basically not so optimistic in respect that China is really living up to its climate obligations despite its diplomacies and policies. However, there might be one factor which might determine a more ambitious climate policies, and that is not so much the direct result of the climate policies. It's much more the result of the technology competition, particularly for clean energy resources, not just towards Europe, but much more towards the United States, with the huge investment and new policy of the Biden administration, which is part of the overall technology of the global technology rivalry and competition for global leadership. And that may force China for a faster decarbonization, not as a result of more obligations of climate policies in the Paris Agreement, but much more as a result of the technology rivalry with the United States in the years and decades to come. As to the US, a few slides you see here, the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis here again, also in the United States, CO2 emission went down. And you also see how that has been developed in regard to the various energy resources up to now. And you see on the left side, that's the energy mix 2019 by the United States, with petroleum and oil being the largest and most important source still. And then you see on the right side what I was referring before, the huge impact of the shale oil and gas revolution. One needs to remember the United States were originally forecasted becoming the largest, or being the largest importer of oil and becoming the largest importer of LNG. Today, the United States, within few years, has become the largest source of oil and gas production worldwide, and has become the third largest exporter even of liquefied natural gas, LNG. So that has tremendously changed, and of course is also an instrument of US foreign security policies and geopolitical power, something which was not existing before 2010. Renewable developments, again, highlighting here the developments in the US. As I said before, it has already led to a change from coal to natural gas as a result of the cheaper natural gas production in the United States. And that actually has also helped the United States to decrease its emission worldwide more than any other country in the world as a result of the shale oil and gas revolution, which has allowed the United States to decrease coal consumption even during the Trump administration, and achieving a deeper reduction of CO2 emissions than any other country in the world. Coming to Europe, as I said, we had these various targets already existing for 2030, including for bringing down the greenhouse emission by 40%. That goal has been enhanced to 55%, and we are now in the process of developing more and more strategies and packages in achieving that. I already have referred to Russia as one of those countries which has not embarked on any decarbonization policies at all, something which is also very strange in a way when you're looking to the German discussion of Nord Stream 2 and other controversial issues. But when it comes to climate policies, there's hardly any critical remark from the German side on Russia's energy and climate policies. And the problem for Russia is very much related also to its permafrost region, covering half of its total territory, which has become warming up. Yeah? And that creates huge environmental and other problems in an area which had been foreseen by developing all new oil and gas fields in this permafrost region, which is then heating up not just the global climate warming, but also the permafrost warming on the Russian side, which will become a more and more costly developing in the years ahead, something which the Russian government has completely overlooked, by the way. But what I wanted to say is, when you're looking to Russia's energy strategy and coal strategy approved last year, then you realize that Russia has still no decarbonization policies in place at all. Its energy strategy suggests that Russia is still increasing its oil and gas production up to the year 2050. It has even a coal strategy in place where it wants to become the largest coal exporter. During the last years, the coal production and exports have already increased. Another development completely overlooked also in the German European policies. So there's also huge contradiction also in the perception of Russian policies here in place. Hydrocarbon, as I said to India, I don't have to repeat myself. These are the developments which we see from the year 2000, 2020, and you know it much better than I do in regard what the Indian government is still designing in terms of its climate and energy policies. At the end, let me also just mentioning just one factor as an example of another of others. With the electrification of industries, of the transport sector, not only electricity, the electricity demand is dramatically rising much faster than the overall energy demand. There are also developments such as Bitcoin, which has taken place over the last years so rapidly that Bitcoin alone has become the sixth largest energy demand source worldwide. Yeah, something which has not been anticipated at all. So here we have, with the digitalization, a number of course developments in place where energy efficiency and energy conservation can be enhanced and improved. But at the same time, these new technologies also need energy, or better to say electricity. And all these new technologies like smart meters, smart grids had been developed in the first design phases without any kind of demand in regard to cybersecurity or enhancing energy efficiency. So we're beginning to enter these technologies and have not taken into account that all these new technologies also demand more energy than before. If I take the example of 5G, where I made a study for the RSIS last year in December, where you can see that beyond the cybersecurity issues being addressed worldwide, 5G may need the double amount of energy or electricity than the previous generation of 5G. And that's at least the lesson we have also from the past when we introduced or moved from 2G to 3G and then from 3G to 4G, we had always a much, much higher electricity demand as a result of these new technologies. So let me conclude, not reading what you can find here in the summary I put. There are still energy megatrends underway globally, which are very much still based on fossil fuels, even in the G20 countries, by the way. And on the other hand, we have seen that we had positive developments for the sustainability goals we all have agreed, and which are so important for the emerging and developing countries in Asia as well as in Africa. But we also see that huge more efforts needs to be done. And then we had the impact of the COVID-19, which are threatening the sustainability goals, even in the midterm perspectives of 2030, which become much more difficult to achieve and much more costly. And given all these finance challenges in coping with the pandemic, which are of course much more challenging for emerging developing countries than for the OECD countries, although even we in Europe struggle, even in Germany with those issues, creating a lot of national debt in the years and for the next generation to come. It's even more difficult for the emerging developing countries. And as long as we don't have a faster global vaccination campaign, also for the emerging and developing countries, then the global economic recovery may not take place so fast as we are hoping for. But that also means that even more or even less money might be available for mid and longer term tasks and challenges for addressing the climate issues, as governments tend to focus on the short term tasks and challenges, understandably, I would add. Yeah, but that makes the 2 degrees Celsius maybe even more difficult to achieve than it was already prior to 2019. And I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. I was speaking too long, I realized.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frank. And I guess those particular points, especially in relation to the coal power plants and the response of the country, and I guess there a detailed chart over that particular point would certainly give us that insight also, and also the way ahead. I would also like to think that the points that you made in your concluding remarks, especially prior to those slides in relation to Bitcoins, would definitely add that particular thing. So thank you so much, Dr. Frank, for that thing. With this, and seeing the paucity of time, I'll quickly move to the from one doctor to the other doctor there. And I'll now invite Dr. Vijay Kumar sir to kindly deliver the chair address for this particular session. Over to you, Vijay sir.
Dr. Devanshu, before I do that, is there any question which could be asked? From the chat box, I could also see.
Sir, yeah, just on the point, because we have the technical session, so we'll take your remark first, and if the time would permit, we'll take it.
Right, wonderful, wonderful. Okay. Dr. Sandeep Shastri, the Vice Chancellor of the University, Dr. Frank Umbach, the Research Director of the European Cluster for Climate, Energy and Resources and Security, University of Bonn, Dr. Pankaj Madan, Dr. Devanshu, participants, a very good evening to everyone present here. I think the presentation, there can be no second opinion. That very vividly, very beautifully, with this, statistical information, with graphs, with charts. I think you have made everything simple and clear for everyone to understand that there is a need to look at the phenomenon or the concept of climate change and take it much more seriously in the years to come. And your conclusion is excellent, that even with all this commitment, it is very, very difficult to arrive at the 2% 2 degrees Celsius reduction, which is not going to be possible. I have always been little critical about such plans, that what is going to happen in the next 30 years, nobody knows, right? And what is going to happen at the end of 90 years, we don't want to know. But the projections that you have made, right? I'm just reminded of another environmental professor from New York, who was talking about the chemical fertilizers used in cherries and and other fruits. And he was saying that if somebody eats so many cherries, right, for so many years, then he would die. That if you calculate, it comes to around 200 to 300 years. Nobody is going to live for 200 to 300 years. But certainly the fact that one need to understand is that there is a point which we need to take it seriously and reduce those aspects which are likely to contribute to the environmental degradation. And I think that point he has made it absolutely marvelous. And I would like to become your student, Dr. Umbach, if it is possible, to understand more and more. One issue which I would like to appreciate from whatever you said, you have also showed one slide in which the per capita countries, I think the emissions, top 20 countries you have shown, in which they are all rich countries and India is not there. Now, if you just correlate the population, the size of the Indian population and the emission, now if you correlate these two, where do we stand? Either in relation to China or in relation to these top 20 per capita emissions countries, the rich countries. So if you just add one more parameter, a variable which is very, very crucial for India, which is also its asset and also its own drawbacks, right? With 1.33 billion people, right, using this type of energy, and the promise given by the government to electrify each and every village, right? So these are all the challenges which one needs to look at it, because development is related to such type of use of energy resources, right? And at this point of time, if you just break something, what would happen to the promises and how the people would be living in this country is one huge challenge that Indian policymakers must keep in mind. But in spite of that, it is also interesting to note that the country, the policymakers in India have jumped into what you call it as a solar alliance, right? In the last decade or even more than 2 decades, the government of India, the government of many of the states, they have used what you call it as the appliances, which are solar-based, energy-based appliances, and that has reduced the dependency on electricity, particularly in the domestic sphere, right? Slowly, it is also coming to industries, universities, and other places, but I think it will take a little bit more time. And I do not know, Dr. Umbak, I'm very happy to inform you that one among the important airports in South India, Cochin Airport, became the first airport in the country which is 100% reliant on solar energy for the use in the airport, right? Following that, even Delhi is trying to create a solar park for its use. I think slowly things are picking up, right? Yeah. But one issue that you also mentioned, transfer of technology remains as one among the huge challenges between the developed and the developing countries, right? If the developed countries are very serious about the sustainable development goals, they have to somewhere flex their control and provide what you call it as a transfer of technology so that together we can achieve. And if that is possible, I hope that why 2%, maybe a little more, 2 degrees, little more also is possible if that is going to happen. But will it happen is $1 million question, not $1 million question, but rather $1 billion question, because IPR is one regime which none of the Western countries would like to bow down or flex it. So therefore, this is one issue which we should also keep in mind as we proceed. You also very well made a mention that a new initiative, the new government in the US under Biden's administration has took a complete U-turn from the previous administration, which is a welcome measure. And I think that needs to be appreciated. And I think we have to work together. And if at all the US is able to get into this fray and try to bring the international pool of experts to bargain and find out how transfer of technology without violating the IPR could make a huge change. And I hope that change is in. Yeah. I will not get into the details of the topic much more than what you have said. It is quite interesting, quite impressive. We all stand to gain from the rich knowledge that you have in this particular area. And when you look at sustainable development goals, which speaks about number of goals, 13 speaks about climate action, right? And that's what your presentation was all about. But I would like to just hasten to add that all these sustainable development goals are intertwined with each other, interconnected to each other, right? If you cannot single out one and say that this is the only thing that we can achieve, because you have to look at sustainable development as a holistic approach, and therefore one needs to understand whether the global players, the global leaders who have come to frame the sustainable development goal, whether they would possibly translate that vision into action by making necessary laws. That's number one. Number two, you may make any number of laws, unless and otherwise you internalize it, you will not achieve anything. So therefore, not only making laws, but internalization of those laws is also important. When I say internalize those values, I also look at the process of implementing them, right? Many of the developing countries fail in that, right? You have very good policies, and a country of this size, this population, implementation from top to bottom, I think many things leak out of the governmental process, and it's very difficult to realize the larger objectives. I will not take much of your time because the session is about to begin, but something is very, very interesting. I was also reading in Economic Times a few months ago that the Bitcoins has been using large quantum of energy. But your statistics is really mind-boggling, saying that this is the 6th largest energy consumer. And I think we need to look at that relationship easily, and whether the profit that the Bitcoin managers do enjoy, at least a 10 to 15% tax could be used towards the climate change processes, will be a wonderful opportunity for us to look at and work on a research project and tell the Bitcoin owners that please contribute 15% of whatever you gain, because you are using the energy beyond what the major countries could use for social obligations. Yeah. If economic obligations could swallow everything, then I think they are to be held responsible, right? So therefore, these are all some important points that I would like to learn from you. And it's a wonderful comparison. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I hope that the presentations made by other participants in this panel would also see the publications, right? And I am very happy to note that Sandeep Shastri already made an observation in the inaugural session that I would also like to have a copy of that just to read and learn from evergreen projects like this, the climate change. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Sandeep Shastri, the KAS family, the CAS family, and Dr. Umbach for giving me this opportunity to be with you this evening and learn a little bit of issues relating to climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure listening to you, and I totally agree. And especially the last point, I guess the legal expert in you and bringing that CSR obligation on the Bitcoin owners would also be that particular point. So well taken into consideration as well. Before I move ahead, I have a very special guest, Peter Remele, sir, and he wants to make a point across. So I'll invite Peter Remele, sir, to please take over to you, Peter, sir.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Umbach, for your very excellent presentation. Finally, you convinced me, I was convinced before, with your methane statistics or chart that it's not the Swiss cows who are responsible for the increase of methane as always promulgated in the news. I want to pick up something Dr. Vijayakumar said in the beginning. We have heard in the presentation, governments, of course, some governments are more committed than others, some not at all. And what they have is, of course, goals. But those goals are not to be reached. And we know already where we are now, that we are far behind. So let me go back to something Dr. Vijayakumar mentioned in the very beginning. He is working on the Bangalore principles. They're very well known to me, and I promulgated them in earlier functions. Those deal with judicial integrity. Maybe we need something like Bangalore principles on climate integrity, what could be somehow promoted with other ones. Governments alone may be not enough, so that some standards are being set and being sort of promulgated among many, not only governments. So that is one comment on that input of the Bangalore principles. And the second one may be the technology transfer. Now we are dealing specifically, of course, as CAS India office, with promoting Indo-German relations also in this sector. If we look at the future, then e-mobility as presented, or mobility in general related to E, does have a large future and will be a future answer. Many questions are open, specifically technological questions. Here we come to the desired technology transfer. And that is maybe where also on the university level, one could work out something a bit more concrete in recommendations, how a increased Indo-German cooperation, including the technology transfer, where definitely there is some knowledge in Germany, and Indian possibilities, and especially India's advancement in IT, could be combined to some good result. That as a comment from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I guess that remark would certainly be accepted to what the presenters have been presenting on to. I guess with this, we'll be coming to the end of this technical session 3, and a wonderful insight, I would call it, and that would definitely be carried to the paper presenters spread across 3 concurrent sessions. A general request to all the paper presenters, please be ready. We'll be starting with the sessions by 5:20 p.m. and the links to your particular sessions is already being circulated. I'll request you to kindly join these particular sessions. With this, I come to the end of this session, and as the moderator as well for this particular session, my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Frank Umbach and Dr. V. Vijayakumar sir for giving such wonderful insights. More to what Dr. Frank, and I guess that was one of those particular clarities over the thoughts that was provided on. Thank you so much, Dr. Frank, and we are looking forward surely very soon to have you physically hosting you here and to learn those particular things, and we can share a cup of tea together, because that's a wonderful thing to have it. And moving to Dr. Vijayakumar sir, thank you so much, sir. It was really a pleasure listening to you. And the remarks, I totally take it across. That's wonderful to take it ahead across. So thank you so much, sir. And yes, I'll also invite you physically for a cup of tea very soon. So we'll be taking this. And with this, I'll just take this point ahead that this was a fruitful day. And I will call it to be the start of the 3rd day. I would thank each one of you. I'll thank the Vice Chancellor, sir, and all the other dignitaries for joining. Thank you, Pankaj, sir. Thank you all my lovely team members from the CAS family and from JDU family. With this, we'll come to the end of this particular technical session. Please join for the sessions signed for the paper presentations in the concurrent sessions 1, 2, and 3, and we'll be surely getting it across.